So once we have the personas, that's our starting point for starting to tell these stories. And that gets us to our next step, which is our journey mapping. So here we want to understand for each of these personas, describe the journey that's going on. And we do this, well, let's talk a little bit about the current and future state. So before we go into the journey mapping, where journey mapping is looking at the future state, we just want to know your team as you're going through this process. So if your team is working on some software or a product where everything is very well understood, then you can just jump right in. I would say, go ahead, jump right into the future state journey mapping. But if you are in a scenario where you have newcomers to the team, or whatever product you're working on has a really deep subject matter subject matter that requires a lot of expertise, then we do recommend mapping out the current state and then using an emotional journey to craft out what the pain points might be. That just helps level set everybody. I don't have an example of that to show today, but just something to know if you are dealing with some newcomers, you might want to look at setting up the current state and mapping it up for people so that they're able to use that as guidance when shaping that future state. But assuming we're jumping in right into the future state, when you get into journey mapping, we really start with the beginning of the story and the end of the story. So in this case, for our paper example, we begin with realizing I'm out of inventory. So I just realized I'm out of paper. And then the end of the journey is when I receive the paper. So the idea here is to put a number of different sticky notes in the middle here to fill out the remaining part of that story. So we'll oftentimes have multiple people go through this and everyone kind of tell the same story just to see where the variations are in the story. But as you start kind of understanding what the story is, it's a matter of a process of kind of going through and refining it. So that's really the next step. As we're going through coming up with these stories and filling in the middle steps that occur as part of that story mapping, we want to ask ourselves questions, and we want to constantly kind of consolidate the stories or elaborate on where they're going. So one of the first questions you might ask yourself is, does this story go far enough back or forward? Is there an ending state to this? We had actually a very recent example with a customer where they wanted access to a record in a database, and we're like, well, why? And turns out that they actually wanted to, they needed that record in the database to run on their report. And we said, well, why don't we add to this story, and I'll go ahead and change the ending of the story to now end with a report as opposed to ending with you accessing a record. So that happens through conversation and elaborating on the stories and the journey. You want to look at what other alternatives there may be, what other people that might be affected, and also what are your competitors or other industries doing. This is the second chance for you to look and say, like, how does one of our competitors tell their story? What's the best part of that? The last question you want to do is what we call our whatabouts. These are, looking at what about edge cases? What about exceptions? How do I deal if there's an outage or back orders? And adjusting the story or creating additional stories based on those whatabouts. So depending on your team and depending on how creative you guys are with coming up with your different journeys and your stories, you might have too many. So that's okay if you have too many. Most of the new tools, and the one I'll show you, Mural, does have a nice voting mechanism. These allow you to, and you can do it in person too, but you get little sticker dots and you essentially vote, give everybody 4 sticker dots, and you vote on which stories you think are the most important. This helps if you have some contention. Maybe you have a couple people that want to do this new high-tech approach and a couple people that want to do the medium approach, and you're not really sure. You can use the voting to help kind of split the decision there. Also important to know, what's really needed in the system, and also it's good to have a conversation, open conversation about what's really feasible. You may have some great ideas, but if we're looking at it, it's like, that's probably not feasible. It might not be something you want to project as your full story. So at this point, we have kind of just base level stories, starting and ending of a story, and we need to start shaping it into an application. That's what our next phase comes in, and this phase is called our feature brainstorming. And this, we really like to think about, in the user's eyes, what are they seeing on the screen? What are they interacting with? Where are they when that's happening? And start filling in those details. So what we do is we take the journeys from before, which are our starting and ending stories, and we basically map them out in a linear fashion and put in details down along each step of the journey. So during each step of the journey, if you look at our paper company one, when they first log on the homepage, they're going to want to browse categories, they're going to want to look at products, and then as they select a product, they're going to want to see, recommended products, they might want to see past orders, they might want to add it to their cart, and then that takes them to the cart, and so on and so on. So really looking at filling in these details is the next phase. And this part of the process is meant to be very fluid, very collaborative, and no ideas off the table. We often say that everyone has a voice here, and we want to make sure that your voice is heard. So no idea is a dumb idea. Go ahead and put it on the board, and we'll adjust it later on. In terms of tips here, again, you really just have to know your team. If you're working with a largely non-technical team, just throw an idea up there. It doesn't have to be too thought out. It can just be, something you're thinking about, put it up there. The part of the job of the facilitator or the, whoever's running the meeting is really their job is to make sure that stuff's cleaned up, confirm, hey, what are you talking about when you mean this? And then help them rewrite those stories so that they make sense. If this is not your first rodeo, you've done this before, we recommend, more of an agile approach where you're writing, as a user, I should be able to do some action so that I can achieve some goal. That mechanism really forces you to attach goals to the features, which is very helpful as you go down the line and you start to reprioritize. And you can also start thinking about some acceptance criteria. As we had some of those kind of edge cases before, acceptance criteria is a great place to put those, but can slow the team down. So I wouldn't recommend that for people who are non-technical or just starting out. The last thing is that's a trick that we usually do, but if you're a designer, you're really the facilitator of this. I recommend doing some experimentation and kind of going ahead a little bit, trying it on your own before getting in front of a large group and doing it. It can be really helpful in kind of seeding the pot if you find that the group's getting stuck or they're not really sure, what kind of details they might want to add. If you have that kind of ready in your head, you can be like, well, do you need how Amazon has recommended products. Do you need something like that? Oh, yeah, I would like that. So those sort of things help you to help kind of encourage the conversation. And that gets us to our last step. So in the brainstorming, we're totally open. You can put whatever you want on the board, but we have to be practical, and we want to kind of circle back to the story that we want to tell here. So what we do from there is we take all the steps and all the journeys, and we start to basically prioritize them down the wall. So in this case, I have some features here in the second journey that, I didn't really need right away. I can maybe make them part of this phase 2. These ones up here in the beginning of the story, they're kind of critical. I'm going to have them in phase 1, or I'm not even going to have a product. And so you can kind of go in the line, adjusting priorities as you see fit, basically trying to tell this conversation around how you think this thing should be built out for your team. In terms of tips for this one as well, consider adding rough estimates. Help the non-technical people rank things conservatively. It's very easy for business owners to look at a product and say, oh, I want this as the most important thing. As a development team, you can add, we've seen teams do yard sale stickers. So the little yard sale stickers are, $5, $2, 25 cents. You put those stickers on the cards, and now the business owners have an opportunity to say, oh, that's really expensive. Maybe I'll push that down. It's not that important. Or, oh, these are cheap. I'll probably, let's go ahead and get those ones out of the way. Conversely, the business owners can put business value on tickets, and then they can earn stories, and then they can have the technical team look at that and understand, oh, this is really important to them. Maybe we can change this card around. Maybe we can swap this card for 2 cards. Maybe we can readjust our approach. And because it's such a high business value, we can ultimately, push it up or come up with an alternative that suits their needs. The last one there, if people are really unsure on where to start, we don't find this too often, but if people are really unsure on where to start, you have a lot of stories, you can consider doing a voting exercise here as well. And it helps just kind of, set the stage on what's really important to everybody in kind of a quantitative measure.